My name is Marcus Thompson, and for 17 years I managed the IT infrastructure at Consolidated Financial Services in downtown Chicago. I started as a junior technician when the company had 50 employees and watched it grow into a mid-sized firm with over 300 staff members. Every server, every network connection, every security protocol in that building had my fingerprints on it. Last Tuesday, they called me into a conference room and ended my career with 3 sentences. "Marcus, we're restructuring the IT department," said Janet Walsh, the new chief technology officer who'd been hired 6 months earlier. "Your position is being eliminated effective immediately. Please clear out your desk and surrender your access credentials." I sat there for a moment, processing what she'd said. 17 years of perfect attendance, 0 security breaches, countless overtime hours keeping their systems running while they slept. 3 sentences. What about the transition documentation? I asked. The passwords for legacy systems? The maintenance schedules? Janet's expression didn't change. "We'll figure that out. Security will escort you to your desk." 20 minutes later, I was standing in the parking garage holding a cardboard box with my personal items. My access badge had been deactivated, my company laptop confiscated, my parking space reassigned. 17 years reduced to a coffee mug, a small cactus, and a picture of my daughter from her college graduation. The security guard who'd walked me out was Tommy Rodriguez, someone I'd helped with computer problems dozens of times over the years. He looked embarrassed as he took my building keys. "This is messed up, Marcus," he said quietly. "Everyone knows you built this place." I nodded and got in my car. As I drove home, I thought about what Janet hadn't bothered to ask me. She didn't want transition documentation or password lists because she assumed she wouldn't need them. The new IT team she'd hired would figure everything out on their own. That assumption would prove costly. At home, my wife Sarah took the news better than I'd expected. After 23 years of marriage, she knew I was methodical about everything, including job security. "What's your plan?" she asked over dinner, cutting straight to the point. I pulled out a small flash drive from my pocket. "I've been documenting things for months. Janet's been making changes to our systems that don't make sense, bringing in outside consultants, questioning procedures that have worked perfectly for years." "What kind of documentation?" "Email threads, budget discrepancies, security protocols that were bypassed. Nothing I shouldn't have access to as IT manager, but patterns that started emerging after she arrived." Sarah studied my face. "You saw this coming. Not the firing specifically, but something." Janet's been systematically undermining everything I built while claiming she was modernizing our infrastructure. I started keeping records when I realized she was setting me up for failure. The flash drive contained 18 months of carefully organized data. Email communication showing Janet's attempts to blame system failures on my outdated methods. Budget reports revealing that her modernization project was over budget by 40% while delivering minimal improvements. Security audit logs proving that several of her changes had actually made our systems more vulnerable. Most importantly, it contained records of her communications with Apex Digital Solutions, the consulting firm she'd hired to replace our internal IT functions. The email trail showed a clear pattern. Janet was systematically dismantling internal IT capabilities to justify outsourcing everything to Apex. What made this particularly interesting was that Apex Digital Solutions was owned by her former colleague from her previous job. The consulting contracts were being awarded without competitive bidding, at rates significantly higher than market standards. "She's been planning to eliminate internal IT from the beginning," I explained to Sarah. "Firing me was just the final step in outsourcing everything to her friend's company." "Is that legal?" "Probably not, but proving it requires documentation that most people wouldn't have access to." Fortunately, as IT manager, I had access to everything. The next morning, I started making calls. Not to complain about being fired, but to warn people who needed to know what was coming. First, I called David Kim, our chief financial officer. David had always respected my work and would understand the financial implications of Janet's plan. "Marcus, I heard about yesterday," he said when he picked up. Completely blindsided me. "Janet said it was part of efficiency improvements." "David, I need 10 minutes of your time to show you something important. It's about the Apex Digital contracts and budget overruns you might not be aware of." We met at a coffee shop near his office. David reviewed the financial documentation on my flash drive with growing concern. "She told the board that outsourcing would save us money," he said after seeing the contract details. "These numbers show the opposite." "It gets worse," I replied, showing him the email communications. Look at the timeline. She started negotiating with Apex before she was even hired here. This was always the plan. David's expression hardened as he read through Janet's emails with Apex's owner. This looks like a predetermined arrangement. Did you share this with anyone else? Not yet. I wanted you to see it first since you'll have to answer questions about the budget impact. The board meeting is next Wednesday, David said. They're voting on expanding the Apex contract. Janet's requesting approval for a complete IT outsourcing plan. What are you going to do? David closed my laptop and looked at me seriously. I'm going to ask some very pointed questions about due diligence and competitive bidding. And I'm going to suggest we postpone the vote until we can review these documents properly. That afternoon, David called me back. I presented your findings to the CEO privately. There's going to be an internal investigation before the board meeting. What kind of investigation? Legal review of all IT contracts, audit of Janet's hiring and procurement decisions, and examination of her communications with outside vendors. They're taking this seriously. By Friday, things were moving quickly. The CEO, Robert Chen, called me directly. Marcus, I need you to come in Monday morning to meet with our legal team. Bring all the documentation you have about IT operations and vendor relationships. Will Janet be there? Janet won't be there, Robert said carefully. She's been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. I spent the weekend organizing my documentation into a comprehensive presentation. 17 years of building and maintaining their IT infrastructure had given me institutional knowledge that would take months for outsiders to replicate. But more than that, I had evidence of systematic corruption that could have cost the company millions. Monday morning, I sat in the same conference room where I'd been fired 6 days earlier. This time, the company's legal counsel and the CEO were asking for my help instead of my resignation. Walk us through what you discovered, said Patricia Morrison, the lead attorney. I connected my laptop to the conference room display and began showing them what Janet had really been doing for the past 18 months. The evidence was overwhelming. Predetermined vendor selection, inflated contracts, budget manipulation, and systematic elimination of internal expertise to justify outsourcing. The most serious issue, I explained, is that Apex Digital Solutions doesn't actually have the technical expertise to manage our systems. They're essentially a middleman company that would subcontract our work to other firms at marked up rates. Robert leaned forward. What would have happened if we'd approved the full outsourcing plan? Best case scenario, significantly higher costs and reduced service quality. Worst case, security breaches and system failures that could have shut down operations for days or weeks. Patricia made notes throughout my presentation. Marcus, would you be willing to provide a formal statement about these findings for our legal proceedings? Of course. But I should mention that there are other employees who can corroborate parts of this. Janet's been pressuring people in IT to support her narrative about system failures and the need for outside help. We'll want to speak with them as well. As the meeting ended, Robert asked me to stay behind. Marcus, I owe you an apology. Janet convinced me that modernizing IT required fresh leadership and that your methods were outdated. I should have questioned her recommendations more carefully. I understand why you trusted her judgment, I replied. She's very convincing, and she had the credentials to back up her claims. The board is meeting tomorrow to review the investigation findings. Would you be interested in returning to work? We're going to need someone to rebuild what she tried to tear down. I thought about it. Going back would mean working with people who'd stood by while I was fired. But it would also mean protecting the systems I'd spent 17 years building. I'll consider it, I said. But there would need to be some changes in how IT decisions are made. That evening, Sarah and I discussed the offer over dinner. Do you want to go back? She asked. Part of me does. I built those systems, and they need someone who understands them. But part of me wonders if this will just happen again with the next person they hire. What does your gut tell you? I thought about the flash drive that had changed everything. A small device containing evidence that had exposed corruption and potentially saved the company from a costly mistake. My gut tells me that sometimes the best way to fight back isn't through anger or revenge, I said. Sometimes it's just by documenting the truth and waiting for the right moment to share it. The next day would bring answers about Janet's fate and my future at Consolidated Financial Services. But regardless of what happened, I learned something valuable about the power of careful preparation and thorough documentation. Tuesday morning brought vindication and an offer I hadn't expected. The board meeting that was supposed to approve Janet's outsourcing plan instead became an emergency session to address what Robert Chen called serious irregularities in IT procurement and management. Patricia Morrison called me at 10:30 a.m. with the results. The board voted unanimously to terminate Janet's employment and cancel all contracts with Apex Digital Solutions, she said. They're also authorizing a complete review of her decisions over the past 18 months. What about the money already paid to Apex? We're pursuing recovery of funds through legal action. Your documentation shows clear evidence of fraudulent procurement practices. The bigger surprise came an hour later when Robert Shin called personally. Marcus, the board has authorized me to offer you the position of Chief Technology Officer with a significant salary increase and expanded authority over IT decisions. We want you to rebuild the department the right way. I was quiet for a moment. 6 days ago, I'd been escorted out of the building. Now they were offering me Janet's job. I appreciate the offer, I said finally. But I need to understand what's really changed. How do I know this won't happen again when the next executive decides my methods are outdated? Fair question. The board is implementing new oversight procedures for major IT decisions. No more unilateral vendor selections or system changes without technical review and competitive bidding. And my team? Several good people were demoralized by what happened. You'd have authority to restructure the department however you think best. Bring back people who were let go, reassign responsibilities, whatever you need. I told them I'd consider it and hung up. Sarah found me sitting in my home office, staring at the flash drive that had started everything. How are you feeling about the offer? She asked. Conflicted. It's everything I should want, but going back feels like accepting that what happened was just a misunderstanding rather than a serious failure of judgment. What would it take for you to feel comfortable returning? I thought about that. Accountability. Not just firing Janet, but understanding how she was able to manipulate the system so completely. And guarantees that it won't happen again. That afternoon, I drove to the office to meet with some of my former team members. Word had already spread about Janet's termination and the canceled outsourcing plan. Kevin Martinez, one of the senior technicians, was the first to approach me. Marcus, thank God you're back. Things have been chaos since you left. Janet had us implementing changes that made no sense, but anyone who questioned them was told they didn't understand modern IT practices. What kind of changes? She had us disable security protocols you'd put in place, claiming they were slowing down system performance. She also gave Apex remote access to our servers for assessment purposes. That was alarming. When did Apex get remote access? 3 days ago, right after you were fired. Janet said they needed to evaluate our systems to prepare their proposal. I immediately called Robert Shin. We have a bigger problem than I thought. Apex has had remote access to your systems for 3 days. They could have copied sensitive data or installed backdoors. What do you recommend? Immediate security audit and reset of all administrative passwords. If I come back, that's my first priority. Consider yourself officially rehired as of right now. Do whatever you need to do. I spent the rest of Tuesday working with Kevin and the remaining IT staff to secure our systems. The security audit revealed that Apex had indeed copied significant amounts of data, including client financial records and proprietary business information. Wednesday morning, I was back in my old office, but with a new title and expanded responsibilities. The irony wasn't lost on me. Janet's attempt to eliminate my position had ultimately resulted in my promotion. My first official act was to call an all-hands meeting with the entire IT department. I know the past few months have been difficult, I told the assembled group. Some of you were pressured to implement changes you disagreed with. Others were told that questioning those changes showed resistance to progress. None of that was your fault. I looked around the room at faces I'd worked with for years. Going forward, we're returning to principles that have served us well. Security first, thorough testing before implementation, and collaborative decision-making. Lisa Park, one of the database administrators, raised her hand. What about the changes Janet made? Some of them have already been implemented. We're going to systematically review and reverse any changes that compromise security or system stability. It'll take time, but we'll do it right. Over the next week, the full scope of Janet's plan became clear. She hadn't just been padding contracts with Apex. She'd been setting up the company for a hostile takeover of its IT functions. Once internal capabilities were eliminated and all systems were dependent on Apex, they could have raised prices arbitrarily or held the company hostage. The legal investigation revealed that Janet had done this before at her previous company. She would get hired as CTO, systematically outsource IT functions to Apex, collect kickbacks from the inflated contracts, then move on to the next target. It's a sophisticated scheme, Patricia Morrison explained during one of our legal briefings. She targets mid-sized companies with established IT departments but conservative management that might be intimidated by claims about technological obsolescence. How many other companies has she done this to? We're finding at least 3 others over the past 5 years. The FBI is now involved because the scheme crosses state lines and involves wire fraud. By Friday of my second week back, we'd secured our systems and begun the process of rebuilding what Janet had damaged. But the real satisfaction came when Patricia called with news about the criminal investigation. Janet was arrested this morning at her apartment. She's being charged with fraud, conspiracy, and computer crimes. The evidence you provided was crucial to building the case. What about Apex Digital Solutions? They're also under investigation. Turns out they're part of a larger network of shell companies used to defraud multiple organizations. Your documentation helped the FBI trace the connections. That evening, I came home to find Sarah preparing dinner and wearing a smile I hadn't seen in months. "You look satisfied," she observed. "I guess I am. Not because Janet got arrested, but because the system actually worked. Documentation and evidence trumped manipulation and politics. Do you regret not just finding another job instead of fighting back?" I thought about that while we ate. 6 months ago, I would have said fighting wasn't worth it. But watching how she operated, seeing how she manipulated people and put the company at risk, I realized that sometimes walking away just enables the behavior to continue somewhere else. And now other companies won't have to go through what we went through. The investigation is going to expose the entire scheme and protect future targets. That weekend, I received an unexpected call from David Kim in finance. "Marcus, I wanted you to know that the board formally commended your actions at today's meeting. They also approved a policy requiring technical review of all major IT decisions by someone with your expertise." That's good to hear. There's something else. 3 other companies have contacted us asking about consulting services to review their IT security and vendor relationships. Apparently, word is spreading about what happened here. Consulting services? The board authorized me to ask if you'd be interested in providing security audits for other organizations. Part-time, in addition to your regular duties here. Good money, and you'd be helping prevent what almost happened to us. I consider the offer. Using my experience to help other companies avoid Janet's type of scheme appealed to me. It would turn my documentation and investigation skills into a service that could protect others. "I'm interested," I said, "but only if the consulting work doesn't interfere with rebuilding our department." The board anticipated that. They're hiring additional staff to give you the bandwidth for both roles. Monday morning brought the first consulting inquiry from a company in Milwaukee that had recently hired a new CTO who was pushing aggressive outsourcing plans. The parallels to our situation were obvious. We heard about what happened at Consolidated Financial, their CEO explained during our phone call. Our new CTO is recommending similar changes, and some of our IT staff have expressed concerns. What kind of concerns? Claims that our current systems are outdated, that we need to modernize through outside vendors, that our internal team lacks the expertise for current technology. It was Janet's playbook almost word for word. "I'd be happy to review your situation," I said. "But I should mention that this type of scheme is more common than most people realize. That's exactly why we're calling you." As I hung up the phone, I realized that the flash drive sitting in my desk drawer had done more than just save my job and expose one person's corruption. It had given me a new purpose, using documentation and evidence to protect other organizations from similar schemes. The investigation that had started with my termination was now expanding to help safeguard companies across multiple states. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption isn't confrontation or revenge, it's simply preserving the truth and knowing when to share it. The consulting work opened my eyes to how widespread these schemes actually were. Over the next month, I reviewed IT operations for 4 companies that had contacted us after hearing about the Janet Walsh investigation. 3 of them were in various stages of being victimized by similar fraud. The pattern was always the same: a new CTO hired with impressive credentials and promises of modernization, followed by systematic dismantling of internal IT capabilities and outsourcing to preferred vendors at inflated rates. What made these schemes so effective was that they exploited legitimate concerns about technological obsolescence. My second consulting case was particularly revealing. Midwest Manufacturing in Detroit had hired a CTO named Richard Stone 6 months earlier. He'd immediately begun criticizing their existing systems and pushing for a complete infrastructure overhaul through an outside company called Vertex Tech Solutions. Our IT manager quit last month, their CEO, Maria Santos, explained during our initial meeting. She said Richard was pressuring her to support recommendations she thought were unnecessary and expensive. I reviewed their documentation for 3 days. The evidence was overwhelming. Predetermined vendor selection, contracts that bypassed competitive bidding, and technical recommendations that would have increased cost while reducing functionality. How much were you planning to spend on this modernization? I asked Maria during our final meeting. Richard's proposal was for $2.8 million over 2 years. I showed her a detailed analysis I prepared. Based on your actual needs, you could accomplish the same improvements for under $800,000 using competitive bidding and phased implementation. Maria's face went pale. Are you saying Richard was defrauding us? I'm saying his recommendations weren't in your company's best interests. Whether that constitutes fraud depends on his relationship with Vertex Tech Solutions. We found that relationship quickly. Richard Stone was listed as a silent partner in Vertex Tech's parent company. He was literally outsourcing work to himself at inflated rates. Maria fired Richard that afternoon and contacted the FBI. The investigation revealed that he and Janet Walsh had worked together at a previous company before developing their scheme independently. But the most significant case came from an unexpected source, the FBI itself. Agent Sarah Chin called me in early November with a request that surprised me. Mr. Thompson, we're investigating a multi-state fraud ring targeting companies through fake IT modernization schemes. Your documentation from the consolidated financial case helped us identify the pattern. Would you be willing to assist with additional investigations? What kind of assistance? We need someone with technical expertise who can quickly identify fraudulent IT recommendations and document evidence for prosecution. This ring has victimized dozens of companies. I agreed to help, and over the next 6 weeks I reviewed cases from 12 different states. The scope of the fraud was staggering. A coordinated network of fake CTOs, shell consulting companies, and predetermined vendor relationships that had stolen millions from unsuspecting businesses. The investigation revealed that Janet Walsh had been part of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that specifically targeted mid-sized companies with established IT departments but conservative management teams that could be intimidated by technical jargon and claims about modernization needs. The beauty of their scheme, Agent Chin explained, was that they were providing actual services, just at massively inflated rates. It looked legitimate to auditors and made prosecution more difficult. My documentation methods became the template for building cases against the entire network. The FBI adopted my system of tracking email communications, contract comparisons, and technical requirement analysis to identify fraudulent recommendations. In December, the investigation culminated in coordinated arrests across 8 states. 17 people were charged with conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. The total amount stolen was estimated at over $47 million. Janet Walsh, as one of the key figures in the scheme, faced federal charges that could result in decades in prison. Her arrest made national news as an example of how sophisticated white-collar crime had evolved to exploit technology fears in corporate America. But the personal satisfaction came from a different source, the companies we'd helped protect. Midwest Manufacturing used the money they'd saved from not implementing Richard Stone's plan to give bonuses to their IT staff and invest in legitimate infrastructure improvements. Their IT manager, who'd quit rather than support fraudulent recommendations, returned to work with expanded authority and budget. 3 other companies implemented new oversight procedures based on recommendations from our investigation. Instead of falling victim to expensive outsourcing schemes, they strengthened their internal capabilities and saved millions in unnecessary expenses. The consulting work had evolved into something larger than I'd expected. Robert Chin suggested that we formalize it into a separate division of Consolidated Financial Services. You've created something valuable, you said during our year-end review. Companies need independent technical audits to protect against these schemes, and you've developed the expertise to provide that service. What are you proposing? A new division, Technical Security Consulting, with you as director. We'll hire additional staff and market services to companies that want independent review of IT recommendations and vendor proposals. It was an opportunity to scale up the work I'd been doing individually. More importantly, it would create a sustainable way to protect companies from the type of fraud that had almost destroyed Consolidated Financial Services. I'm interested, I said, but I want to maintain involvement with the criminal investigations. This problem is bigger than just protecting individual companies. Agreed. The FBI work would be part of your responsibilities. By the end of December, we'd established Technical Security Consulting as a separate profit center within Consolidated Financial Services. I hired 3 additional consultants, including the IT manager from Midwest Manufacturing who'd blown the whistle on Richard Stone's scheme. Our first major contract came from an insurance company that wanted us to review IT proposals from 5 different vendors. Using the analysis methods I developed during the FBI investigation, we identified 2 vendors with suspicious pricing and predetermined relationships with internal advocates. "You probably saved us from losing several $1,000,000, their CEO told me after we presented our findings. "We had no idea how to evaluate these proposals independently. That became our value proposition: independent technical analysis for companies that needed to make major IT decisions but lacked internal expertise to evaluate complex proposals objectively." The irony wasn't lost on me. Janet Walsh's attempt to exploit companies' insecurity about technology had led to the creation of a service that protected them from exactly that type of exploitation. On New Year's Eve, Sarah and I attended the company holiday party, something I'd missed the previous year due to the chaos surrounding my termination and rehiring. "Any regrets about how everything turned out?" she asked as we watched colleagues celebrate. I thought about the question seriously. The past year had been stressful, demanding, and emotionally challenging. But it had also revealed capabilities I didn't know I had and created opportunities to help people in ways I'd never considered. "No regrets," I said finally. Getting fired was terrible at the time, but it led to exposing a major criminal enterprise and protecting dozens of other companies from similar schemes. "What about the flash drive? Do you still have it?" I smiled and pulled the small device from my pocket. "I keep it as a reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply document the truth and wait for the right moment to share it." The flash drive that had started as a defensive measure against what I thought was workplace politics had become evidence in a federal criminal investigation that dismantled a multi-million-dollar fraud network. As we drove home that night, I reflected on the lesson that would guide my work going forward. In a world where expertise can be faked and credentials can be manufactured, objective documentation and careful analysis are often the only reliable ways to distinguish truth from manipulation. The consulting work would continue to grow. The FBI investigations would likely uncover additional schemes, and companies would keep needing protection from sophisticated fraud. But none of that would have happened without the simple decision to document what I was seeing and preserve it until someone was ready to listen. 6 months later, Technical Security Consulting had become one of Consolidated Financial Services' most profitable divisions. We prevented fraud at 37 companies, recovered over $23 million in inflated contracts, and testified in federal court cases that resulted in convictions for the entire criminal network. But the work had revealed something troubling. The Janet Walsh scheme wasn't an isolated phenomenon. Sophisticated white-collar criminals were systematically targeting mid-sized companies across multiple industries, exploiting management's fears about technological obsolescence to justify expensive and unnecessary outsourcing arrangements. The FBI had expanded their investigation to include similar schemes targeting HR functions, marketing departments, and even accounting operations. The same pattern appeared everywhere. Hire a new executive with impressive credentials, systematically undermine existing capabilities, then outsource everything to predetermined vendors at inflated rates. "It's become a cottage industry," Agent Chen explained during one of our regular briefings. Criminal enterprises that specialize in infiltrating companies and redirecting their budgets toward fraudulent vendors. My role had evolved from documenting individual cases to developing systematic approaches for identifying and preventing corporate infiltration fraud. The methods I'd created for analyzing IT schemes were being adapted to protect other business functions. The breakthrough came when we identified the recruitment network. While reviewing background information for executives involved in various schemes, we discovered they were all placed through the same small network of executive search firms. These firms specialized in mid-level positions at companies that were growing rapidly but lacked sophisticated hiring processes. "They're not just placing criminals randomly," I explained to Robert Chin during our quarterly review. "They're strategically targeting companies that fit specific profiles, established but not highly sophisticated, growing revenues that justify modernization spending, and conservative management that can be intimidated by technical expertise." How many companies are potentially at risk? Based on our analysis, probably thousands. Most won't detect the fraud until significant damage has been done, if they detect it at all. Robert leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. "What do you recommend?" "We need to go public with what we've learned. Companies need to understand how these schemes work so they can protect themselves proactively." The decision to publish our findings was controversial within Consolidated Financial Services. Some board members worried about revealing too much about criminal methods, while others concerned that publicizing our anti-fraud expertise might make us targets for retaliation. But Robert supported the transparency approach. If we keep this information private, more companies will be victimized. Our responsibility extends beyond protecting our own consulting clients. In March, we published a comprehensive report titled Corporate Infiltration Fraud: How Criminal Enterprises Target Mid-Sized Companies Through Executive Placement. The report detailed the methods used by the Janet Walsh Network and provided specific recommendations for prevention. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within a week, we'd received inquiries from over 200 companies requesting security audits. Business publications picked up the story, and I found myself being interviewed about white-collar crime prevention on financial news programs. More importantly, the report led to proactive investigations by companies that recognized warning signs in their own organizations. 12 additional fraud schemes were uncovered and stopped before significant damage occurred. But the most satisfying result came from an unexpected source: the Consolidated Financial Services Board of Directors. Marcus, Robert said during our April meeting, the board has voted to spin off Technical Security Consulting as an independent company, with you as CEO and majority owner. I was stunned. Why would you give up a profitable division? Because the work you're doing is too important to be limited by our capacity. As an independent company, you can scale up to meet demand and focus entirely on fraud prevention. The offer included startup funding, transfer of all existing client contracts, and the right to hire away any current employees who wanted to join the new venture. It was an opportunity to build something significant from the ground up. Sarah and I discussed the decision over several weeks. Leaving the security of a steady corporate job to start a company was risky, especially at my age. But the work had become more than just a job. It was a mission to protect companies from sophisticated criminal enterprises. What does your gut tell you? Sarah asked, echoing the question she'd posed a year earlier when I was deciding whether to fight back against Janet's scheme. My gut tells me that this problem is going to get worse before it gets better, I replied. Criminals are becoming more sophisticated, and companies need better protection than they're getting now. Then you know what you need to do. In June, I officially launched Thompson Security Consulting as an independent firm. Kevin Martinez and 2 other consultants from Consolidated Financial Services joined me, along with the former IT manager from Midwest Manufacturing and a retired FBI agent who specialized in white-collar crime. Our first major contract came from a Fortune 500 company that wanted us to audit their entire vendor management process. The investigation revealed sophisticated fraud in their facilities management contracts that had been ongoing for 3 years. How much did this cost us? Their CEO asked after we presented our findings. Approximately $8.7 million over 3 years, I replied. But the bigger concern is that your vendor management vulnerabilities could have enabled much larger fraud if left unchecked. By the end of our first year, Thompson Security Consulting had prevented over $150 million in fraud across dozens of companies. We testified in federal court cases that resulted in convictions for 43 criminals, and our methods were being adopted by companies nationwide. The FBI invited me to speak at their annual white-collar crime conference, where I presented the systematic approach we developed for identifying corporate infiltration schemes. The presentation was attended by agents from all 50 states and several foreign countries dealing with similar problems. What you've created, Agent Chin told me afterward, is essentially an immune system for corporate America. Companies that implement your recommendations become much harder targets for sophisticated fraud. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source, Janet Walsh herself. I received a letter from her federal prison, where she was serving a 12-year sentence for her role in the criminal enterprise. The letter was brief and to the point. Mr. Thompson, I wanted you to know that losing my position at Consolidated Financial Services was the beginning of the end for our entire operation. Your documentation and investigation methods made it impossible for us to continue operating. While I regret my actions, I respect your thoroughness and professionalism throughout the investigation. I showed the letter to Sarah that evening. How do you feel about receiving that? She asked. Oddly satisfied, I replied. Not because she's in prison, but because the work we did actually stopped a criminal enterprise that was victimizing dozens of companies. Any regrets about how it all started? I thought about the flash drive that still sat in my desk drawer, the small device that had started everything. Getting fired from my job at Consolidated Financial Services had been devastating at the time, but it had led to uncovering and stopping a major criminal conspiracy. No regrets, I said. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the foundation for the most important work you'll ever do. 2 years after Janet Walsh was arrested, Thompson Security Consulting had grown to 12 employees and was working with companies across North America and Europe. We'd prevented hundreds of millions in fraud, helped convict dozens of criminals, and created systematic approaches that were being taught in business schools as best practices for vendor management and executive hiring. The irony wasn't lost on me. Janet's attempt to eliminate my position had ultimately created an entire industry focused on preventing the type of fraud she'd specialized in. Her scheme had been so sophisticated and damaging that stopping it required developing new methods for corporate fraud prevention. But more than anything, the experience had taught me the value of persistence and documentation in fighting sophisticated corruption. The flash drive that had started as a defensive measure against workplace politics had evolved into evidence that dismantled a criminal enterprise and protected countless other companies from similar schemes. On the second anniversary of my termination from Consolidated Financial Services, Sarah and I attended a conference where I was receiving an award from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners for contributions to corporate fraud prevention. Any thoughts about where you'd be if Janet hadn't fired you? Sarah asked as we sat in the hotel restaurant afterward. I considered the question. Probably still managing IT systems and complaining about executives who didn't understand technology. I'd never have discovered this capability for investigation and fraud prevention. So in a strange way, you're grateful to her? Not grateful exactly, but I understand that her actions led to something important. Sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up revealing capabilities you didn't know you had. The flash drive that had changed everything was now displayed in a frame on my office wall, a reminder that careful documentation and patient investigation could triumph over the most sophisticated deception. But more than that, it represented the power of turning defensive measures into offensive capabilities, using the tools created to protect yourself to help protect others. Janet Walsh's scheme had been designed to exploit companies' vulnerabilities and steal millions through sophisticated manipulation. Instead, it had led to the creation of systematic defenses that made such schemes much harder to execute successfully. Sometimes the best revenge isn't personal at all. It's simply making sure that what happened to you can't happen to anyone else.